All right, welcome everybody. We are now, excuse me, in our third and final session for the day. And joining us is Michael Guidi, presenting from his book, Shrouded in Light, Naturalistic Planting Inspired by Wild Shrublands. My name's Susan, and I serve on the ELA Annual Conference Committee, and I'll be your host for the session. Before we get started with Michael, we'd like to thank our hosts for the 3 in-person events tomorrow. Excuse me, getting over a cold. We have 3 in-person events coming up tomorrow on Friday. They are located at the New England Botanic Garden at Tower Hill, the Cape Cod Museum of Natural History, and the Stoneleigh Garden. So we hope that you'll be able to join us in person at one of those locations. ELA programs are driven by your interest and the volunteers that help make events like this one possible. And if you like what you see, or if there's something that you wish to see, please tell us. If you have the energy and the time to spare, it'd be great to have you join an ELA committee. The Education Committee, Publications Committee, Membership Committee, and a soon-to-be-formed Advocacy Committee are always looking for new faces and voices. If you're interested, please get in touch with us. A few housekeeping notes just to make sure you have the best experience possible today. Please post your questions in the chat as they come up. We'll be recording those and we will do everything we can to get all of those questions answered. If we haven't answered your question by the time we hit 2:30, we will be able to continue the conversation over a bit. And because it's the last session of the day, we don't even need to transfer to the speaker garden room. We can just stay right where we're at. This presentation has been approved for one LACES CEU. There's a tab in the main room that has all the quiz and related CEU information. And while you're at it, don't forget to check the main space for job listings and other possibilities. And now on to our final session with Michael. So if we could go ahead and spotlight Michael now.
All
Excellent.
right. I think,
Oh, let me give you your introduction first.
oh, can I leave my screen like this? Sorry.
Yeah, that'll be fine. So
Okay.
Michael Guidi is an ecologist and horticulture researcher who is passionate about naturalistic plantings that embody the flexibility and resiliency of wild systems. His work draws inspiration from liminal urban spaces and wild areas alike. Michael is a proponent of dynamic, self-sustaining gardens and green infrastructure as alternatives to static, high-maintenance landscaping. His research links ecological theory with horticultural techniques and designs to broaden the definition of gardens and gardening. Michael worked as a field biologist before joining the Denver Botanic Gardens, and he holds an MS degree in ecology from the graduate degree program in ecology at Colorado State University and a BS in biology from Ithaca College. So please join me in welcoming Michael Guidi.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And thank you for having me here today. It's a huge honor. Susan said I'm Michael, and I'm zooming in all the way from Denver, Colorado, where I'm currently at the Denver Botanic Gardens, where I oversee the horticulture research program. I'm an ecologist by training, and a big focus of our work here at the Gardens is integrating the disciplines of ecology, horticulture, and design. So conferences like this one, these interdisciplinary conferences are just so exciting to me, and it's been really interesting to hear the perspectives shared at the conference so far. I'm here today to share some ideas from a book called Shrouded in Light, which I co-authored with my colleague Kevin Williams, where we kind of extol the beauty of shrubland plant communities and explore some of the philosophies and strategies to help us better appreciate them, understand their lessons, and use them as inspiration to create a dynamic and resilient gardens. So Kevin and I both grew up in rural upstate New York in eastern landscapes like this one, where As most of y'all know by those pins on the map, deciduous forests and dense woods are broken mostly by towns, farms, abandoned agricultural meadowlands. And so our ecological, horticultural, and sort of aesthetic training started here in this lush sea of green. And our eyes were trained to these particular dominant plant communities. But we experienced profound shifts in our perspective when we moved from New York to Colorado. Coincidentally, we moved here in the same year, and it really reshaped the way that we perceive and accept landscapes. And it inspired us to write Shrouded in Light, not only to celebrate the unique beauty of shrubland plant communities and explore garden making philosophies that they inspired, but also to emphasize the importance of exposure and immersion. Exploring places like Shrublands can be a powerful gateway to these lessons. So like I said, our minds got blown wide open when we moved to Colorado and started our kind of Western explorations. We had the same kind of amazed, visceral reaction to the new surroundings and shocked by the beauty and starkness of the environment. It was so much different from what we knew, that lush sea of green, but also so dramatic and compelling. The forests and fields that we were used to were replaced by this endless tapestry of shrublands on scales that we could really barely comprehend. On the steppes or dry plains, we were knocked out by these shimmering, light-drenched silvers of species like rabbitbrush and sand sage. And as we moved up into the mountains, the dry montane, multi-stemmed kind of woodlands of serviceberry and juniper and scrub oak created this kind of bridge between shrubs and trees and challenged a lot of our traditional thinkings about plant morphology in relation to shrublands. In the wetter mountain biomes, there's kind of these lush areas of shrubby cinquefoil, snowberry, lots of willows that wrap around the crumb-holst evergreens struggling to survive at the high elevations. And on top of the world, even on the alpine tundra, these tight cushions and these fungus-like expanses of subshrubs mix together to stabilize the rubble. In the Great Basin, we were just absolutely smudged by the sagebrush sea. 150 million square miles of Artemisia badlands, more than 4 times the size of the state of Pennsylvania. And our immersion in these shrublands of the Western US was life-changing. Their pervasive presence sort of activated what we've started to call our shrubland recognition systems. And so in our personal and then professional travels, we started to see them everywhere and really found ourselves lost in this huge intercontinental hedge maze. So in the brutal escarpments of the Southwest deserts, this defensive and the succulent scrub mixes with xeric resinous shrubs. It's kind of like very dangerous, but also beautifully perfumey. And in the dry desert forest, these bold, colorful scrub kind of continues this visual story of the kind of crazy landscape that surrounds the forest. And the Sierra Nevada hosts the complex and powerful mixed California chaparral, which persists for decades, maybe even centuries, until it inevitably burns and starts anew, like we've tragically just seen in the past couple of months in Los Angeles. And the adjacent knotted waves of coastal soft sage scrub runs for literally hundreds of miles along the Pacific coast. We were just totally snagged by crazy scenes like this, Oplopanax horridus, or the Devil's Club, in brilliant fall color in the ericaceous-laden forest floors of the Pacific Northwest. And, even in the southeast, the humid, tangled Poccasin, also called a shrub swamp, covers hundreds of square miles. Sometimes in person and sometimes through the accounts of our coworkers and friends, we traveled to places like the arid acacia woodlands of the Australian outback, wandered through the rich heathlands of temperate Europe, and saw the pungent sclerophyllous scrub of the South African fynbos. We saw the thorned chicken wire mesh of euphorbias in the Greek Phrygia. And our eyes could barely kind of handle the battery acid green of these azurella shrublands of Patagonia that wrap all around the Andes Mountains. We bushwhacked with the clematis and rhododendron in Tibet, and we're kind of eaten alive by this crazy dense thorn scrub in tropical Mexico. We noticed the glossy leaves of shrubs lighting up the understory of deciduous forests in the west and beyond, and the bristling darkness of these shrubs kind of exposed by this intense, persistent environmental exposure and radiation from intense sunlight. We met these impossibly ancient shrubs at the edges of dry woodlands, and our explorations led us through shrublands hidden in plain sight at the edge of our biggest cities. And we walked through shrubland communities that dwarf any city or really any human creation. And we examined the minuscule worlds of what we call nanoscrub, this tight, self-contained type of vegetation that's really easy to walk right over, yet it kind of holds the building blocks of the earth and soil together. In short, we kind of saw shrublands everywhere, which surprised us a bit. We saw shrublands in places we called grasslands. We saw shrublands in national forests. We saw the complex, important ecosystems, both holding their own definite space and then also ambiguously weaving into other types of spaces, other types of landscapes. So we began to think about these places, the places we were seeing, the timescales that existed on, the environments they emerged in, and we found it useful to break them down into two distinct but fluid categories of shrubby occurrences, what we call the model shrubland and the alternative shrubland. So a model shrubland is kind of a classic stable shrubland biome. These places exist where environmental conditions are placing plants under almost considerable stress, and landscape succession is happening very slowly, if ever at all. For example, the extreme pH ranges of the heathlands of the world, the aridity of deserts, and the wind-blasted coastlines are all host to these very stable, long-lived shrublands that cover huge swaths of continents and our coastlines. On the other hand, alternative shrublands exist in these more limited spaces, liminal conditions are under shorter timescales, and they're all often kind of nestled into or play at the edge of other dominant plant communities. They often depend on disturbance events like fire or flooding or grazing or human mowing here in this case to create extreme or abnormal conditions that interrupt some sort of ecological stable state. The idea of alternative shrublands also embraces this idea that plant forms and morphologies that act like shrubs and form extensive communities are really shrubs but might not be often recognized as such. For example, clonal trees connected by underground root systems, or on the opposite end of the size spectrum, mat-forming multi-stem woody perennials. You know, with all the shrubs surrounding us, we had to ask ourselves, why did it take most of our lives to see these patterns and recognize how ubiquitous and omnipresent these creatures really are? And why do they go so often underperceived? And then kind of the real applied question is, where are all the shrubland gardens? Part of the answer lies in history. You know, traditionally, many shrublands have been considered difficult places. Scenes like this one pictured up on the slide might be described as tangled, illegible, challenging. And in a garden, we might consider this to be cluttered or unappealing from a human perspective. It like lacks those discernible layers we look for example. And this is a rhododendron thicket, actually, in a native habitat in West Virginia. And of course, we love azaleas and rhodies in cultural communities, and they're so widely adopted and embraced, but in their natural communities, they don't know anything about plant spacing requirements and vertical layering. You know, these thickets were called rhododendron hells by early American colonists, considered these impenetrable, inhospitable places. And landscapes like this one, comprised of what we might call more open scrub, which is commonly encountered in drier or coastal habitats. These places haven't fared much better. Agriculturally, they're perceived as unproductive, trash ground, plant wastelands, kind of too woody to graze, too thick and thorny to navigate, no good for agriculture, and often left as public ground, not even really worth owning or selling. And a lot of what we've noticed is that humans approach these landscapes with the philosophy of changing them into something that we deem to be productive. And honestly, we've done a really good job from that perspective. And unfortunately, this history of management has been one of the biggest reasons we think that we've never really embraced shrubland archetypes into our design landscapes. The narrative that they just aren't places that hold value, I think, has really distracted us from the stunning beauty, enduring productivity, and the incredible ecology of these shrubland communities. And of course, we all know, on the other hand, we've had a much easier time accepting and adopting grassland, foreland, and even forest and savanna systems into our gardens, mainly because they're reminders of abundance. They conjure images of maybe fire regimented hunting grounds, shaded grazing grounds, these kind of pastoral or even agricultural scenes that promised harvest, security, and comfort. Really, these are places, from our perspective, that exalt human control, landscapes that maybe are places of ease and relaxation. And, we actually have this sort of curious case of what we're calling shrubland amnesia playing out in these landscapes right now. There's a really cool article on the website Ecological Gardening by Adrian Fisher, where he points out that the historical accounts of Midwestern prairies are really accounts of mixed grasslands full of shrublands, savannas, and woodlands. This totally heterogeneous kind of environment. Filled with dozens of fire-tolerant shrubby species, things like American hazelnut, New Jersey tea, crabapple, sumac, prairie willow, huckleberries, blueberries, and so on. And in this article, Fisher kind of considers that our omission of shrubby plants from current prairie plantings or our current prairie stylings is a cultural landscape amnesia. The prairies were destroyed. In the popular discussion was that among pioneers was really about sod busting, right? Not shrub busting. And the forbs were kind of mourned and relegated to progress or just advancement of society and culture. But the shrubs kind of became the hedgerows surrounding fields, farmhouses, and they took on this whole new identity as agricultural, ornament or icing. And they lost their wildness in that way. A question we ask in the book is how different the new perennial kind of movement or zeitgeist might be playing out right now if we could remember or understood what it was like to wander through these dogwood, false indigo, shrub meadows and eat wild plums and just experience that amazing habitat heterogeneity. The other side of it is that to us, it feels like often we don't want to remember. We don't want to remember these things. And maybe our memories of shrublands run a little bit too deep, lingering just beyond our complete kind of like taming and control of the earth, tied to a pre-agricultural era of hunting and gathering. And even though this may have been a more unstable time for humanity, if we can approach these landscapes through that lens, more connecting to our maybe animalistic roots, recognizing the vital role that shrublands played in our survival and evolution, then maybe they can reveal themselves as of abundance. Throughout our history, shrubs have been vital to humans, offering fuel, forage, habitats for countless harvestable animals. Even a carefully pruned shrub in the wild can be the sign of like some sort of nearby browsing animal, like a deer or elk, right? In this really recent book that came out last year that's absolutely brilliant called Hedgelands, the author Christopher Hart dives into this largely forgotten practice of creating mixed living species of woody hedges across the United Kingdom. And he talks about their many benefits, from providing habitats to supporting crop production. And he makes a compelling case that we need to reclaim space for these complex biotic structures and learn to live alongside them again. And he also points out that these hedges along agricultural rights of way are essentially stand-ins or analogs for the vast thorn scrub that covered much of the United Kingdom and Europe, for around 12,000 years during the Holocene. Really, this only disappeared because of human activity, agriculture, and the decline of megafauna. And one of Hart's big theses in the book is that hedges and shrubs are caretakers of all life. In England, they actually have this saying that thorn is the mother of oak because oaks recruit so well in these kind of like shrubby habitats. And plants, animals, human animals, whatever, shrublands have some of the highest biodiversity outside of the tropics. And this is partially due to that complex woody vegetative structure that they provide in the landscape. And something that's really interesting to us is that this is holding true whether a shrub or a hedge is dead or alive, or maybe both, as a lot of work in decaying organic infrastructure is now revealing. Shelter and structure are proving just as crucial in creating meaningful habitat as providing pollen or nectar. Especially since these structures, along with the kind of dead architecture of shrubs, remain undisturbed across multiple growing seasons and garden generations. Habitat requires water, food, shelter, but something we consider is whether we should add the fourth element of time, something that dead hedges, shrubs, hedges, and shrublands provide. And from a garden making perspective, we see dead hedges as maybe kind of this like gateway back into shrublands. They've become really popular in the UK. And maybe it's this way of like offering people the chance to engage with passive materials as they reacquaint themselves with these ecosystems. A lot like their living counterparts, dead hedges can survive as these like linear intensified versions of shrublands. Whether it's a brush pile, or what, you invite the shape, form, and function of a shrub back into the landscape with this kind of necro architecture. And it dawned on us that it was kind of this beautiful, weird circular arc. First we destroy the shrublands, we confine them into these spaces that we deem useful for agriculture, kind of forget their original presence. Then we repurpose their remains, we build these fences and structures from them, and then we finally kind of return these remains to the landscape, restructuring them to mirror their kind of living forms that we've now come to understand support a rich diversity of life. And hopefully that will also release some of our control and invite shrublands back into the equation. Last fall, Kevin and I had the honor of visiting Prospect Cottage, which you might recognize here, maybe considered Derek Jarman's greatest achievement at work. We were blown away, and but what we didn't realize was that it's actually a shrubscape. Prospect Cottage is this shrub maze that kind of breaks that notion of the hedge used in England to define space, and it cuts it out into this open, uniform, freeform kind of seaside landscape. And it kind of creates this fractured kind of formalism, where the rigid lines of conventional gardens kind of dissolve into this wild, tamed, like unbounded environment. And one of the reasons that this garden is so revered is because it recognizes the unique opportunities of the landscape, offering not just a unique design style, but a fresh approach to nurturing life in a harsh, unforgiving environment. Jarman understood that this place was challenging and inhospitable, and yet within it, he kind of crafted life drafts, these shrubs, these small resilient sanctuaries that bring both beauty and vitality to this really harsh coastal terrain. And the reason this works, biologically is because, the branched persistent structure of shrubs slow the air in the boundary layer. They cast these diffuse shadows. They create microclimates of higher humidity and rich duff layers kind of under their own bodies through their own shedding. And when birds, mammals, or anything else kind of scurries, eats, and defecates in these spaces, they drop seeds and fertilizers at the base of shrubs, which now act as a natural nursery. And this is a real ecological phenomenon called the nurse plant phenomenon. It was first it's a phenomenon in which plants kind of facilitate each other's growth, and it was first observed and described in the relationship between the desert shrubs of mesquite and creosote and the saguaro cactus in the Sonoran Desert. But it's since been identified in shrublands all over the world, and it's been shown that these effects, these facilitative effects, are crucial for maintaining diverse ecosystems, sort of in contrast to that competition narrative that we hear so much about in plant ecology. So we end up with this interesting phenomenon, which is inherent in the natural aesthetics of shrubs and shrublands, are the aesthetics of all of life. And part of what we're trying to get at in the book is by accepting them, we're accepting maybe a deeper understanding of what beauty is beyond what just makes us as human beings happy. And maybe to make something really beautiful, we need to think about what other beings find beautiful, what they'll find useful, what attracts them. And we need to make and encourage these non-human spaces. But in the lens of shrublands, this means making those things, even if it can make us feel a little bit uncomfortable, given that long, maybe less than harmonious history that humans have with shrubland plant communities. Feelings of discomfort, unease, or hesitancy, they're common and real emotions that we face in wild spaces or places where maybe we're not in full control or we can't sense the dominance of human influence on the earth. But this is also partially what makes these places exciting and thrilling and full of potential. But part of what we're getting at is we don't often intentionally evoke these kind of feelings in our garden spaces. And ultimately argue that we actively avoid them. There's this somewhat tired dialogue that gardens are spaces for healing, for comfort, for pleasure. And these things are absolutely true. But part of what we're getting at is we need to make and allow for gardens that connect to a deeper spectrum of human emotions and states and validate kind of a greater range of states of being a human being, the human experience, and celebrate that gardens are places of growth and change just like we are. Complex, complicated, challenging gardens, they force us to face them as other things, others, these independent entities that aren't just architectural fodder, but really alive with their own intentions. And this may all seem a bit abstract, but we think that shrubs and shrublands are a great entry point for having this different conversation and introducing this idea into gardens, because shrubs are so weird and they're weird creatures with these kind of weird social properties. Generally speaking, they're not the flora that we walk over, right? They're not grasslands or forbs, and they're not the flora that we walk under. They're human-sized, humanoid vegetation that takes up our space in the world. And maybe this is kind of discomforting for us. Borrowing from Timothy Morton, we kind of categorize shrubs as this intermediate growth form, something in between. They're this idea that's both real, but also imposed on the world. And like so many organisms, in reality, they exist on this spectrum of thoughts and realities, and to define them is kind of to misrepresent their true characteristics. Shrubs live in this world of excluded middles. They're slightly what they are, but they're also slightly what they're not. Shrubs can be gangly and awkward, cute and monstrous, and because they exist in scale with us, reflecting some of our own qualities, part of what we think happens is they're able to kind of inhabit this perceptual phenomenon known as the uncanny valley, where the more human something looks, while not perfectly approximating us, the stranger it can kind of make us feel. But again, we don't often face this. Just kind of like the Disneyification of emotional states evoked by gardens, we also tend to deny or erase the weirdness of shrubs, and honestly, many plants and ecosystems, by taming them into these more easier to digest forms and states, forcing them to become a little bit isolated or even commoditized, kind of like zoo creatures. And a question we pose is that if this is sort of our traditional culture and horticulture, then maybe we need to look beyond it for a new one, a new culture. And in order to change our culture, we need to allow for new language and new ideas. Language and culture are so closely connected. Language shapes how we perceive the world, our values, how it preserves our tradition. It gives us identity. It can also uphold prejudices as well. It can work in the other direction, can narrow our ability to describe new experiences, and trap us in kind of a way of thinking or a paradigm. It's comforting and reassuring to work within what we know, but we should always be examining whether or not our thoughts or work are kind of just stuck in a proverbial hedge maze, if you will. In Shrouded in Light, we use Shrublands to examine different terms that we might need maybe to be able to better understand plant communities and future landscapes. We look at, for example, the necroarchitecture of ambistatic life, to consider creatures that contain both living and dead parts. We look at polychronal life forms with body parts composed of different ages, all living in harmony. And Kevin's love of hardcore punk and black metal is used as this artistic frame of reference to better understand the alternative aesthetic outcomes of garden implementation. And I'm going to get to some more plants in just a minute, but I want you to hang on with me for just another couple minutes through these ideas. Because part of what the book is doing is incorporating terms and ideas from philosophy as well, a branch that we call the philosophical post-humanities. And we think that this particular way of thinking could have some really profound implications for how we create, understand, and accept gardens. So at its core, this philosophy kind of posits that all entities, regardless of their nature, should be regarded as equal, and acknowledges the rights and influences of everything in the world. And really, we think that this lies at the heart of our work with plants and landscapes. Right? We dedicate our time to studying, nurturing, and celebrating an entire kingdom of life as gardeners, landscape designers. And we garden because we love these beings and we believe that they deserve to be here on this world as just as much as we do. And if we accept this philosophy as the basis for our work, then we can dig deeper. And really, it's absolutely brimming with these incredible ideas that could, we think, radically change how we garden. One is called the preservation of finitude. And it kind of offers this idea that our relationship to something can't be translated as a complete knowledge of that thing. So, and the related idea of withdrawal brings us a bit further, allowing an object to kind of be independent from other objects and from its own actions and appearance. So, something can't, in effect, be only what we perceive it to be. They have this unknowable quality. Plants aren't reducible to our uses, our categories, or our designations. We can take advantage of this in the garden sphere by embracing and celebrating what we consider to be unplanned actions and the effects of our gardens on the surrounding landscape, instead of rushing to control those unplanned actions or effects. The philosophy also proposes breaking what's called the law of non-contradiction. And that allows for seemingly contradictory elements to be true and for something to be both itself and not itself at the same time. Helps to break apart kind of that dualistic concept of nature and human culture but it also recognizes the complicated nuances within our concepts of ecology. A garden can be a place for both human and non-human people. A shrub can be both alive and dead, without it being in conflict. The idea of veering is understanding that nothing in the world really has a truly rigid definition. We exist on a spectrum of identities as people, a spectrum of states, motives, purposes. And if we can, we switch between them as much as we like, as much as we want. And a species, likewise, is just a point in time. It's not a genetic end. Many plants, like I said, can be both dead and alive at the same time. And we don't need to reconcile this back to just sort of a binary state. It is or it isn't. Veering allows us to understand the fluid nature of being and accept the many forms a plant, garden, or landscape, or even us in the process of making those things might take. Attunement happens when we sense and take on the energy, appearance, or intentions of another being, and in those moments kind of develop an understanding or connection with that thing. In other words, we veer towards something else, and in that process, we absorb a bit of it. When we garden, we begin to understand the world through whatever plant or plant community we're working with. The mesh is the idea of connected diversity. The mesh exists in the space between objects where living and non-living things kind of connect and interact. This is an ecosystem. The mesh is a true interlacing of parts, the underlying goal of ecological horticulture, really. And it's how separate pieces, separate elements become whole and become a system. And symbiosis brings us one step further by giving agency and identity to the mesh. Symbiotic systems are collectives that don't have these self-defined spatial or temporal boundaries. Their influence and control of what happens in these places are distributed among the components that make up a collective. Symbiosis is closely related to the idea of emergence from systems theory that describes how complex systems can develop novel behaviors or characteristics from an interaction of their parts. Systems are evolutionary and they have the potential for surprising change. And, it's abstract, but to us, this is the definition of a garden, and we believe it's how a garden should work. We should be gardening for symbiosis. This is horticultural thinking that recognizes that plants are other beings that can be our partners in a process of successfully living in the world, not something to just be controlled. And for us, all these concepts lead to the idea of refuge, of acceptance, regeneration, hope. They're places of biological, ecological diversity, recovery. Places where everything can develop, grow, and heal and recover while still being in the world. And really, the question is, isn't that the type of space our gardens should foster? And these are all big ideas, and there's a lot more. I'd encourage everyone to dig into a couple of those titles that I flashed by earlier. And I know it can kind of be strange to consider how they immediately apply to gardening, but we currently do design and garden with ideas before plants are even involved. Nativity and invasion, formalism, naturalism, post-wildness, food security, pollinator diversity, water conservation. All of these are huge ideas that drive our gardening and gardening practices with more history and kind of, suspicious intention behind them than we'd like to admit. And, if you leave here with nothing else, then we'd like you to leave understanding that, we garden with ideas before we garden with plants. And to paraphrase one of those post-humanist authors, it matters what thoughts think thoughts. We have this really interesting, to us anyway, example of how the power of thoughts and ideas are making worlds right now in the digital realm of artificial intelligence, where the feedback loop of human culture is training this entirely new force on our perceptions and opinions. Using large language models and these deep learning software programs, they're writing the future based fully on the words, concepts, knowledge of the past, of what humans have put out there into the physical world. And we're really interested to see how these tools interpreted shrubland gardens. And so we requested OpenAI to make these images to see what the current kind of thinking, the current zeitgeist would produce. And we received some of these really evocative glimpses into our collective understanding of shrublands and gardens. By asking AI to create these gardens, we're asking the program to learn what it would consider to be a shrubscape based on our own species work in the physical realm. All the limitations, the expectations, the creativity and hope for our future are kind of wrapped up in these images. And now that we've willed them into existence because of our keyword inputs, they now exist to be interpreted again and again. And these future communities will continue to kind of be looped back into different iterations. All of this to say, as this is a reminder again of the importance of continuing to add to the conversation of collaboration, cross-training, and discipline mixing. When we describe to a set of beliefs, refine or define our language, and just kind of spit out jargon, we're doing nothing but kind of limiting the possibilities for the future. And letting us know different beings, even those that we consider to be have ways in which they communicate to the world around them. And this is also why visual and maybe nonverbal languages and expressions are so important. In other words, just kind of experimentation, doing weird stuff. Going back to that idea of attunement, if you want to understand what it's like to be in a stand of shrubs covered in trash, growing in the middle of a city, cover yourself in trash and shrub camo and sit with the shrubs. Making gardens, physically making and tending the world around us is one of the best ways of communicating with all the other beings on the planet. By the way, our publisher deemed this photograph to be too disturbing for the book, so you're all just lucky enough to see it today. So in that realm of using non-linguistic ways to understand the world, one of the other tools that we turn to understand shrublands and turn them into shrubscapes and invite some of that weirdness and complexity of their shapes and actions into our gardens is abstraction. So abstraction is really useful, we think, because the patterns and language of wild systems often appear intricate, so intricate, in fact, that they can be unreadable or chaotic and therefore kind of like untranslatable. So imagine trying to describe, the scene here only using, symbolic written language. So much would be lost in that communication. So, using these non-representational kind of compositions, we can kind of understand a little bit about the impact of these landscapes just through the spatial and tonal magic of the abstractions. And similarly, without even knowing the plant species to the right, on the right-hand picture, you can kind of feel its energy and flow. And we use this applied abstraction in the book, what we call extracts. And we use it to highlight the spatial patterning that helps make that underpins each one of these plant communities and helps to make them feel maybe attainable in garden settings. Really, they're just geometric simplifications. We drew inspiration here from Keith Haring and other neo-expressionist artists to kind of like iconically break down these scenes in nature to their simpler components and then kind of use them as layouts that can transpose the effect of the landscape elsewhere, like into our gardens. For example, this heathland, this is in the Saco Heath Preserve in southern Maine. It's this incredibly complex system, hundreds of species interweave here, and untangling this into a legible design might feel like a really daunting task. But it could also be really simple when we think about it. A dominant species here, leatherleaf, separates the other species in the mix into these kind of like shrubby masses. But it also has this effect of creating islands of accumulation and contrast. Having a few well-placed upright, larger shrubs or perennials or trees with upright habits could kind of help break this up and add dimension to the maelstrom. Maybe this is good for a gardener who wants to kind of flirt with wildness, but wants to retain some traditional legibility. Because it would create distinct legible areas for the main species while still allowing room for those unexpected actions and evolutions in the garden, right? And again, we're back to control because it's a tricky thing. And the key would be not to control, a simplification like this as a final design, but to let the natural interactions of plants play out. And that's really how we feel like you can recreate a place in spirit and energy, even if you're not exactly taking one-to-one plant placement from the wild. Another example, this is a recently disturbed or burned Carner Barrens of the Albany Pine Bush Preserve in New York State. And here masses of sweet fern provide these like amazing textural breaks around all sorts of shrubs. We're generating scrub oaks, sassafras, herbs like bracken fern. But unfortunately, since this can be kind of a difficult space to read, instead of diving deeply into this extremely diverse shrub layer, we often, from a design perspective, just point to the need for a clear separation between the upper and lower canopies as the only way to make this space acceptably kind of attractive. But if we dive into the chaos here in that shrub layer, we can see that there's really interesting contrasting forms and textures that we think are really visually playful. There's all sorts of undulations, moments of rest and exuberance. And honestly, the pine barrens and the pine bush in general are just such incredible models for gardens in the Mid-Atlantic region because besides being extremely beautiful, they thrive on this awful soil, sandy soil ranging from full sun to full shade, regularly surviving catastrophic burn. These are surprising spaces, and we need to be seeking out more surprise in our gardens overall. So another tool that we used and that Kevin has actually used in a project that I'll share with you in a minute is something that we call wild systems emulation, which is just another design technique that seeks kind of visual examples of surprising visual actions or visual occurrences to be a jumping off point for the arrangement of a plant design. And this can be the result of intentional or unintentional forces from any source, human or non-human. So it kind of hinges on this idea of refining what wild means to simply mean something that's surprising, allowing us to open up our wild influences to a much range of sources beyond what we might just consider to be, quote unquote, nature. What we found is that using these snapshots of constantly changing systems to guide the placement of plants or plant communities and architectural elements, it's had this like short-term effect of creating gardens that feel like they're already in motion upon installation and a long-term effect of encouraging a competitive and evolving garden. So for example, living art systems from human origins, like graffiti, they mimic natural plant communities really well, in some ways better than a lot of other things crafted by humans. They're impulsive, and they're kind of like this palimpsest constantly being written and rewritten over and over again, very active and alive. There's something new, a new, bloom or population, if you will, in every moment. And we'll never be able to find, this exact scene again. It's always changing. And really, again, to us, this is a garden. Lichen patterning is almost like a natural camouflage. Symbionts of algae, fungi, and yeast are such incredible creatures. And using lichen as a basis of design puts the starting point for our work into a complex collaborative decision-making process managed by multiple organisms. Even computers breaking down can be inspiring. Computer glitches are these unintentionally like usually, hopefully, very ephemeral errors and expressions in wise, unchanging, very complicated but regimented system. This beauty is caused by miscommunication. And taking influence from these systems might be pretty abstract, but that's sort of the point, because starting in a place with less personal control as a designer, we think kind of helps to soften our expectations for a final outcome and learn a little bit better about how to partner with gardens that we make as they evolve over time. We've applied this system of design to a few sites in the Colorado region in really uncomplicated ways, essentially a lot like the shrubland extracts that we offered up to you earlier. One of them is Summer Home Garden, which is this public pocket park in Denver, Colorado, with a plant palette based on shrublands of southern Colorado and the desert Southwest. So this project was designed and implemented by Kevin Williams and my colleague Sonia Anderson, and very recently was actually featured in Claire Takesh's new book, Visionary. And the garden layout was inspired by a graffiti utility box, believe it or not, using wild systems emulation techniques. So just like those graffiti examples I was showing earlier, this is kind of a radical object. It's been spray painted, stickered on top of stickered, wheat pasted, and then just battered by the natural elements over the years. And the result is this kind of crazy collage that no singular person, being, or force could have planned. And this was used quite literally by putting plant groupings randomly aside within the spatial suggestions of the markings. And the result was this very active, bright, and immersive space that's full of its own agency. And the plants of the shrubscape kind of push and drape over the forms and textures all over each other, creating this kind of unified mass with constantly changing interest that shifts and builds from the first bulb emergence in the spring to the final autumn flares. And Summer Home is really kind of has this true feeling of wildness that's lodged itself really squarely in the community. And it's gone from a place that takes back from the ecosystem to a generative space filled with dozens of species that are giving back by habitat and resources. And this is at the heart of the kind of post-humanism. It's this relinquishment of control, the decentralization of human dominance, right? That's part of what happened here by changing this from a housing lot to an abandoned lot to this kind of like multi-species designed pocket park, right? This decentralization of dominance, diminishing our influence over the biosphere. And it's this positive shift, and one that encourages us to embrace and celebrate differences and to reconnect with other beings we share the planet with. And a really fantastic example of this is at the Rachel Carson Wildlife Refuge in southern Maine, where restoration ecologists there have chosen to think like cottontail rabbits, basically, transforming farmland into this thriving coastal shrubland, offering this, what we think is this really powerful blueprint for how we can reimagine and nurture landscapes that are more in tune with the needs of an evolving world. The early successional shrubland habitat in this region is critical for the survival of dozens of charismatic animal species. American woodcock, the ruffled grouse, eastern towhee, but their star is the New England cottontail rabbit. But due to development and all these kind of historical and agricultural contexts, these plant communities that the cottontail rely on are few and far between. So they're connecting networks of hayfields and these kind of fallow farms and converting them into shrublands. And in this one plot alone, the Rachel Carson staff and volunteers planted over 1,100 shrubs in a single day. And as you can see, the only site prep was mowing, no spraying, tilling, or landforming, meaning that the ground layer of grasses and herbaceous plants will kind of regrow around those added shrubs, creating this creating a dense mesh, a mesh of roses, elderberries, chokecherries, dogwoods, willows, meadowsweet, all left to kind of grow together for decades. And even remnant crab apples and autumn olives still participate in these dense thicket making procedures and haven't been removed by staff because of what they have observed that they offer to some of the native fauna. So those are just a couple examples, and there's many more in the book. But part of what we wrote the book is because there is to inspire people to make more of these things. You know, we wanted to expand the conversation of garden making and to really highlight why shrubs and shrublands are such critical tools for, um, you know, kind of getting over ourselves in this process of inclusive gardening. Um, and we deeply believe in inspiration over instruction, and we just like to encourage everyone to kind of set something in motion and, you know, embrace your role as a human messing around on the earth, creating ugly things, beautiful things, creating for us, but also creating for other things. Um, and the message we leave readers with is that gardens don't have to exist at all, but since they do, we kind of feel it's our responsibility to make them as weird and different as the world needs them to be, and as weird as they have the potential to be. And we believe that shrubland emulation can be this entrance point for this, but it's not an end-all be-all. So as you design, build, destroy, and impose future gardens onto the world, please just consider the awesome partner that you have in the beauty, complexity, perseverance of the shrublands of the world. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Michael. Wow, that's a lot to take in all at once. It was some amazing eye candy too. Really, really stunning. Thank you so much. We've got a bunch of questions for you. Uh,
Perfect.
so let's see. First one, do you work with conservation efforts to conserve sage grouse with shrubland restoration?
So we don't, I don't personally, but that is something that a lot of biologists in the state of Colorado are concerned about. Other states have larger intact areas of Artemisia tridentata habitat. So that is where a lot of the conservation is happening, but we do Colorado, but we're not directly involved. But again, another great example of a charismatic animal that, you know, deeply relies on these like shrubland habitats for survival.
All right. Another one we have is whether there's an optimal dimension for dead hedges where you're balancing habitat for wildlife versus concerns over fire hazards and also just human aesthetics generally.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I feel like all of the ones that we've put into practice, both here at the gardens and into the community, have kind of like retained that human scale that I was talking about. So they're not too much taller than an average human, and kind of like have that like density or bulk or mass in the landscape, even though linearly they might be very long. So that's kind of the scale we've been working at. And we actually have some monitoring here on site to look at like kind of look at the interactions that this necro architecture dead hedges are providing to native fauna. And we've got folks out there counting birds, looking at invertebrate and arthropod kind of utilization of resources from the dead hedges. And we've already cataloged hundreds of species that are using them in the middle of the city. But I think, you know, Kevin and I were just in Pennsylvania a couple weeks ago, and we were asked a really interesting question by some folks who are trying to build a horticulture program that's for students that can be applied anywhere. And an online program that can get more people involved, kind of like a course or something. And like, we were getting our brains kind of picked for ideas, and what we both kind of wanted to say was just like it's a bad idea. And the reason it's a bad idea is because so many of these things are have to be locally contextualized to your ecoregion or bioregion. And like I don't think putting a dead hedge around your Altadena, home is a good idea given the natural fire regime there. But like it's likely not to cause an issue in like a temperate deciduous forest, right? So I feel like those questions of like size, scale, and like proximity are like have to be like locally contextualized, and the landscape can often give us a clue as to like what's appropriate. And I feel a little bad because that maybe is like sort of a cop out, but that's sort of the answer that we have to give.
Of course, all things
Yeah,
are local and all things are
yeah.
specific to place. So this is a related question. Someone wrote in, I'm interested in your approach to abstraction and the diagrammatic images you've shown focused on plant layout, and how does soil, water, pH all factor into the concept of abstraction for when applied to design, and how you shape the ground and the flows of energy in addition to placing plants.
Yeah, yeah. So I think like that could get complicated real quick. I think, for example, on the in the summer home example that I showed you, that site was in some ways easy to work with because of its uniformity. There's always going to be microhabitats and microclimates in a given site, but for the most part, it was flat with not much undulation, difference in soil, temperature, wetness, pH, or anything like that. So that tool of abstraction could be applied kind of like uniformly over the space without those considerations. But I do think that part of those like using a guttural kind of like inspiration, like an abstracted painting or graffiti or lichen or something like that, that randomness, you can kind of select elements or groupings that can be placed appropriately based on whatever environmental gradient you have. So another way we've done this is just through randomization. So we've used computer programs to essentially like you plug in a few site parameters and then you ask it using like atmospheric noise data to just randomly assign things to that space based on one or two criteria. So that's another thing where we like just harness the randomness of the world to like, but also like knowing that we've got real constraints in the ground, right? So it's abstract and we're still harnessing that, but we're giving it a couple of rules, right? Um, Trying to think of another example that like might address some of those things. The other thing we've done is we've used like digital tools to like stitch multiple like sources of like abstract inspiration for a site together that kind of might reflect differences in the actual site conditions. An example of that was a project that I put in just last year for an art school that wanted like a xeric garden that folks could interact with and used harvestable materials and other art supplies. But it was a really heterogeneous site, and we stitched together different like fiber art projects from that school that were like abstract in kind of their appearance like digitally, but each of those kind of like pieces of artwork represented a different kind of climate zone or moisture zone or soil zone on the site. So that was like an example where we um, used a few different sources and then kind of did that kind of random stitching together to like account for those site differences. But hopefully
Right.
that answers the question.
Yeah, well, so
Yeah.
going from the random to the more managed, we have a couple questions on maintenance. Do you have any notes on long-term maintenance of thickets? Do you plant it and just let it evolve? Do you see a need for periodic cutting back or pruning, possibly even mowing to the ground? And do you have any examples of times when you felt the need to go in and edit out individual unwanted plants throughout the thicket? which seems like that could be a difficult maintenance task.
Yeah, totally. I think as many shrublands that exist in the world, there are like appropriate maintenance strategies for like the applied version of that shrubscape. So here in Denver, Colorado, we, I think a lot of the audience is probably on the East Coast, and our planting a shrub means that that shrub will stay a shrub, and planting a tree without irrigation means that that tree will probably die. So, you know, it means that our landscape kind of like converges naturally on this limited kind of form, right? Shrubs don't get too big. They're kind of limited by these natural factors. So if we want that kind of shrubland in our climate, that's not a big deal. But we also recognize that in like Eastern climates, that the shrublands that I highlighted in the presentation remain shrublands because of disturbance events, whatever they might be. So yes, periodic mowing is definitely um, a big maintenance strategy. And we actually do that here too for just like controlling size in very specific situations. So for example, we've put kind of what we're calling shrub meadows on like right of ways or health strips. But the mowing regime, instead of like once a year for like an herbaceous system, goes to like once every 5 years. Once the kind of shrubs start to like take up a lot of space, maybe block traffic views, impede other like, functional aspects of that environment for people. And then a brush hog just kind of goes through and brings it back down. But the species that are in there can tolerate that because they're either like fire adapted species, resprouters, or grazing adapted. So that's like a good example. But yes, and I think that goes back to that idea about time, where in many ways that lessens the maintenance burden. Because you kind of have these like longer time windows in which like those intensive disturbance events aren't like required to kind of let whatever your intention is come to fruition, right? It's dependent on you not disturbing it for 5 years so that the shrubs can kind of gain their mass and form. But then cutting it back just resets the system, right? Um, but again, that kind of like defers that maintenance and it doesn't have to be done quite as frequently. Um, but yeah, I think there's a lot of different examples of successful maintenance regimes. And like even on the West Coast, there's a park that we highlight in the book called Land's End, which kind of emulates the coastal sage scrub. And like their maintenance strategy is really nothing because those are stable, long-lived shrublands without any sort of like fire interval that naturally occurs. So yeah, hopefully that gives some ideas.
All right, I've got a very easy one for you. Would you mind listing off the books that were on your slides?
Yeah,
There were 3 or 4 of them, and a number of people wanted to get those titles and managed to scribble 1 or 2 before the slide was gone.
yeah, absolutely. I can, what's the best place to put that? Can I just put it in the chat?
Yeah, if you don't
Yeah.
mind typing that out, that'd be
Yeah.
great.
Yeah, I'll do that. I'm happy to take more questions while I'm doing that.
Actually, I think unfortunately we might be at the end of our time here.
Oh, okay, gotcha.
I have just a few closing things before we head to the final event of this conference, at least for the virtual part. Of course, we still have some in-person things tomorrow. First of all, I just wanted to thank you again for your time today and these expansive thoughts. That is a lot to take in. So thank you very much for all of that. And for participants, if you could please complete the session evaluation, which can be found on one of your content tabs for this room. We do welcome your feedback. And this does conclude our last session of the track. The final presentation of the conference will be a keynote by Banu Subramaniam, He'll be speaking on For the Love of Plants. And after his keynote is finished, you're welcome to visit the networking room for a happy hour with colleagues. And once more, hope to see you tomorrow at one of the in-person meetups. We will be closing this room in about 2 minutes or so. And we thank you all for being here through today and yesterday, if you're managing to join us then. And we will see you back at the main space for the keynote.